Hey, everybody, welcome to the webinar. This is Cannabis Without Borders, Global Policy and Market Trends. We're going to talk about a lot of interesting things, starting with the backdrop of cannabis and international law, all the way through developments that are happening on a country-by-country basis, including as recently as today, if you can believe that. Jason's been madly updating the presentation. So I am going to quickly introduce myself, and then I'll let Jason self-introduce. My name is Vince Sliwoski. I'm a business lawyer. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, where I'm licensed. I'm also licensed in Minnesota. And in addition to being a business lawyer, I've been a cannabis lawyer for like 15 years. And I've done a lot of work at the intersection of international law and cannabis because our firm has always had an international bent. And we've done a lot of, in the cannabis realm, things like import export. People like looking into how they do that for medical and scientific purposes. Import export of hemp, which is a little bit different. We've helped a lot of people do foreign investment in cannabis in countries that are getting off the ground in various kinds of programs. And then general advisory stuff to even other countries about like how things work in the context of the single convention and such. So a lot of interesting projects over the years, and always love talking about this very interesting subject. And I'm really happy to be here with Jason, who honestly I think knows more than anybody about what's going on a country by country basis as far as developments and policies. Jason, I'll let you talk a little bit about your background too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Vince. I have been working in, I'm a business attorney as well. I've been doing international cannabis policy for my entire time as an attorney. I've been tracking international cannabis on a country by country basis for 7.5 years. And I have and currently do maintain basically a tracker. So I get about 100 Google alerts a day, combined with my contacts and many countries. I update that so that pretty much I would say that I can talk about any country in the world and their cannabis policy off the top of my head. But if there's something I don't know, if someone asks a question here, there's pretty much nothing I can't at least find out within a minute or two, kind of relying on the tracker that I maintain. I am licensed and located in Colorado. I'm also licensed in Arizona and New Mexico. And I have worked with governments, primarily in the EU, but I have kind of advised them and worked with them on international treaty obligations as it relates to cannabis specifically, as well as federal rescheduling here in the US. And so, that's a little bit, I guess, about me. Like Vince said, I do have a few updates that may not show up on these slides that just came in my last update about an hour ago. So I'll bring those up when we get to it. But I think a good place, as Vince said, to start, and I know he'll lead it off, is kind of the background, the international treaties that kind of guide everyone's policies. While everyone basically, I don't know a single client who's actually been interested in the international treaties until the DEA actually and HHS brought it up in the rescheduling. And so it is extremely important, especially for countries outside the US. So I think that's an excellent place for us to start.
Okay, let's start there. And I know in the announcements for this webinar, we didn't say submit your questions in advance, which we sometimes do. That's not to say we don't want questions. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat and we'll try to get to it. If it's relevant and helpful to everybody else, we'll try to get to it. If you watch this whole thing and there's something you're interested in that we weren't able to address, feel free to email us after. And also we will repost this webinar on our blog, Canalaw blog, which is maybe how a lot of you found us, and also YouTube. If you want to watch something, watch this again later if you think you missed something or want to revisit something we said. Okay, so let's talk kind of briefly about the backdrop here, which is public international law and the treaties at issue. Really, we have two up there. The one that's more relevant to marijuana is the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, and that one was actually amended by a protocol 10 or 11 years later. I think it was 1972. It's a very, very big, broad treaty. You know, most treaties don't have this many parties. This, I believe, last I looked, had 186 countries signed on to it, and it's basically everybody. There's no giant economy that's not signed on to this treaty. The countries that are not signed on are little like island nations. Maybe the most notable would be like Haiti or Nauru or something like that. So all of the major economic global world policy players are parties to the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. It prohibits production and supply of many drugs except under license for specific purposes like medical treatment and research. The Single Convention is different than the Controlled Substances Act that Jason briefly mentioned when we're having rescheduling here. And it's different in a lot of ways, but one is just sort of the basic scheduling. It creates 4 schedules of controlled substances, not 5. And it's kind of reversed, where in the United States, Schedule 1 drugs are the most strictly controlled. That would be Schedule 4 under the Single Convention. It's got some interesting provisions we should cover briefly. Article 36 requires parties to adopt measures against cultivation and production. And then it's got some enforcement protocol stuff via that amendment I mentioned in 1972. We got a new body, international body called the INCB, International Narcotics Control Board, and that brought some sort of enforcement provisions because generally speaking, international law is not really that policed and it's based a lot on political norms and such, but there are enforcement measures for unauthorized import-export cannabis. So how does the Single Convention define cannabis? It is defined as the flowering or fruiting tops of the cannabis plant, excluding seeds and leaves from which the resin has not been extracted. It also separately defines cannabis resin as the separated resin, whether crude or purified, obtained from the cannabis plant. It's important to note that there's not a THC threshold requirement like in US law or separate scheduling of the THC cannabinoid. And because there's not a cannabinoid threshold, there's no definition of hemp, right? They don't really have that concept in international law, a legal definition of hemp. In fact, the treaty provides that it doesn't apply to the cultivation of the cannabis plant exclusively for industrial or horticultural purposes. Okay, so since only cannabis resin, and extracts and tinctures of cannabis are listed in the schedule of the Single Convention, some analysts and governments consider CBD not to be a narcotic drug within the meaning of the Single Convention. That's kind of a separate analysis we can get into with people who are interested in import and export of CBD. That's a very country by country basis consideration. The Single Convention importantly also states that the production, manufacture, export, import, distribution, trade-in, blah, 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 cannabis should be limited exclusively to medical and scientific purposes. This treaty has been around a long time. Like I mentioned, it was amended in 1972 to add some enforcement protocol. But more recently than that, after many, many years, in late 2020, the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs voted to reclassify cannabis and cannabis resin to recognize medical value explicitly. That was a big deal. That was recommendations made by the World Health Organization, which is an organ of the United Nations. It moved cannabis to Schedule 1 on the UN Convention. Now remember, that's a less restrictive schedule. It moved it to 1 from 4, where it had been listed along heroin, fentanyl analogs, and other opioids. I can't remember what else is on there. Very notably, the United States offered a statement in support of the move, which is interesting because, as Jason mentioned, we're now talking about rescheduling here domestically, and our Health and Human Services and Food and Drug Administration has said we recognize medical use and it ought to be rescheduled. We haven't got there yet for reasons we may not even get into in this webinar.
And
go ahead.
Oh, just a point of clarification. There was actually on both 1 and 4, and it just got removed from 4.
Yes, thank you.
Which acknowledged, most importantly, and as I'll mention here in a minute, that acknowledged its therapeutic value was basically by removing it from 4, which for U.S. rescheduling is I think, a key point.
Yeah, that's an important clarification. Thank you. I forgot it was actually on both, but now it's not, which is great. I don't know that I'll get that. I mean, there's certain other things in the convention that are probably helpful here, like Article 23 and 28 requires each party to establish a government agency to control cultivation. In the United States, we have something called NETA that's kind of well known. It's down in Mississippi. There's other things like Jason just mentioned, 1 and 4. Under Article 28, the cannabis leaves are also subject to some light measures of control. That's not really the kind of stuff we want to talk about today, because not that many people are interested in importing and exporting cannabis leaves, right? You're more interested in the plant and the scientific and the medical avenues for export. I will say that there have been a lot of questions about in the United States, for example, do treaties like the Single Convention trump our ability to allow states to legalize marijuana? There have been issues with soft defections at the national level, with countries really relaxing their drug laws. I mean, the big elephant in the room is probably Canada, which full on legalized. And that's in violation, I would say, of their treaty obligations. Uruguay, other states have done other things, and some have argued there's flexibility in the treaties, others are not. And then you get to even bigger questions like, do human rights concerns trump these drug control treaties? And sometimes practical concerns, like in the United States, is it even possible to comply? Does our Constitution allow the federal government to tell states they can't do these programs? So a lot of big sort of thorny legal questions. We're not going to get into those here, but hopefully that just sort of sets the stage for what it is and where we're at. I kind of talked over this next slide. Sorry, I was talking and not doing slides. So we're going to skip a few slides. They're available later. Jason, I think, mentioned briefly marijuana is placed on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act. That happened to us in 1970, so about 9 years after the Single Convention was adopted. The sort of popular mythology or way of talking about it was like, Nixon did that because he's an evil racist and a bad guy and he wanted to fight the hippies and everything else. That's probably all true, but the United States was also required to deal with cannabis and to schedule cannabis under their treaty obligations. So, this followed 9 years after the country signed on to the Single Convention. We went further than required. We controlled everything. We didn't have an exemption for hemp until 2018 when the Farm Bill passed. There was a 2014 pilot program, but really 2018 was expressly removed from the CSA by Congress in 2018. And like I mentioned before, as it says on the slide, the Controlled Substance Act sort of requires us to ensure that scheduling adheres to our obligations under the Single Convention, same as every other country. Maybe at this point, Jason, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about EU law. I think you know it better than me. Would you be willing to talk on this slide?
Yeah, and one thing I also want to mention that really kind of helped me when I first started to get into understanding the treaties and where they regulate, and especially, so there are three of them: the Single Convention, 71 and 88. The Single Convention deals with the plants. The 71 deals with the substances. So for cannabis, Single Convention is cannabis, 71 is THC. So that's just kind of a good way to look at it there. And now also HHC, which was recently just added to the 71 convention. And then 88 just kind of is more enforcement and kind of re-emphasizes the requirements that honestly most countries are breaking anyway in a lot of ways. The EU, though, poses a really interesting and a unique kind of problem for countries who want to legalize commercial programs, because as Vince said, the Single Convention limits countries to medical, scientific, and industrial purposes. And though industrial isn't defined, if you read the commentary and the history behind the Single Convention, it clearly does not allow for adult use. That was clearly the intent to prohibit it. And again, as Vince mentioned, that even with including kind of a quasi-enforcement INCB bureau, and there really is no enforcement mechanism. I mean, you can have meetings and kind of bilateral discussions, but there really is no like strong enforcement mechanism under the Single Convention. EU law incorporates their drug laws, and EU members have to adhere to both the 2004 framework decision and the Schengen Agreement. And I'm not going to go into those in detail. There's been plenty of people who've written about them. I've written a little bit, but I'm definitely not an expert on this, but I am quite familiar with kind of how this works, especially when it comes to cannabis. And the interesting part about the Schengen Agreement is it also applies to countries that deal economically with the EU. So like Switzerland. Switzerland we'll talk about here in a bit, but that also just kind of adds a unique layer to Europe in general. But EU law, and why it's really different than any other European countries or really anywhere else in the world, and why you've seen countries have real difficulty in implementing commercial programs, is because EU law implements really strict sanctions for those that violate these agreements. And Germany and basically German, really all of them, Malta, Germany, Luxembourg, Czech Republic, they all kind of went in with very lofty goals of full commercialization to eventually just scale those back into the programs that we have now. Germany, I think, was our biggest hope. It's the largest economy in the EU. And if Germany had kind of pushed forward and forced the issue, we were kind of hoping that that would then force the EU Commission to potentially just kind of let it go, or at least adopt a framework around cannabis that allows for such a program to exist. And we'll talk about kind of the EU Commission also here in a bit. But EU law can be, I mean, substantial fines, and they were going to happen. In the vote at CND in 2020, the EU had agreed to vote for approval of removing cannabis from Schedule 4, and Hungary actually bucked that vote and voted against it. Sanctions were brought, and Hungary was punished, and I think they're actually still going through that right now. But if Germany would have, let's just use Germany as the example, because again, that's the one everyone thought was going to push forward with commercialization. If Germany would have moved forward with that, Hungary almost certainly would have brought sanctions or sought sanctions against Germany. And that can be as much as I believe it's 2 million euros a day that Germany could have faced if that law would have been implemented. And so faced with that, also Germany's known for complying with laws and doing things very kind of by the book, and ensuring that they're in compliance. And so facing all of that, Germany decided not to move forward. And then Malta, Luxembourg, smaller countries that had kind of less leverage. And Czech Republic was another one that we thought was going to move forward. I'll hold off on talking about them because they're one of the countries I do talk about here in a minute. But that's just kind of a unique perspective of the EU.
Okay, and then our next slide sort of compares EU, right, with what's going on in the United States and what's going on in Canada, Uruguay. Do you view those as sort of like big sort of buckets of approaches for different jurisdictions?
Yeah, I mean, especially being an attorney in this space, a United States attorney in this space, dealing with both attorneys and non-attorneys, policymakers, civil society outside of the United States. The United States' position and what has been discussed at the CND by our State Department are kind of two things. One, that the United States is in compliance with the single convention, and that because of our federalist system, well, there are kind of two arguments here. The single convention allows for a country, they say that a country's prohibited from doing things unless that goes against their kind of constitution. Our constitution prohibits the federal government from forcing states to do things. They can do it themselves in the state, but they can't force a state to say pass a law to prohibit cannabis sales. And so it's
specifically what Jason's talking about there, I think, is the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, right? Where the government can't force the state to do anything, and it can't force the states to enforce its own laws. The feds can't say, you have to enforce the Controlled Substances Act for us in your state. No, the states get to do what they want. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, in legalese, it's the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the United States. Also recently, I believe it was last year at the CND, Representative Pat Prue spoke about how the restrictions are more on an outward look. So if the US wants to export and kind of enter the world market, then the adult use kind of prohibition, she didn't say that specifically, but it kind of the restrictions apply to that and not a domestic only program. So kind of like what the US is dealing with on a states' rights issue, where if you don't go outside of the state kind of controls. That was kind of the argument being brought up at the CND about the US. It's more outwardly focused and not inwardly focused. European Union, I already spoke about. And then Canada and Uruguay, they both legalized and have acknowledged that their programs do operate outside of what's permitted in the single convention, but that they believe that they're actually adhering to kind of the higher arching goal of really all treaties, and especially the drug treaties, which is the health and welfare of society, and to kind of aid in protecting youth and harms against society. And so that's really where a lot of the focus on legalization and adult use programs are, with single convention at least. But again, European Union, which is where we see the most activity recently, has their own agreements and monetary sanctions that are kind of, while those are legitimate arguments, it's a risky bet to play.
It's interesting that Canada and Uruguay don't withdraw from the treaty and rejoin, right, with a reservation as to Canada. Do you know why that is? I've never asked anybody that.
I mean, there has been a lot of talk with those countries. I mean, they didn't do it then, which again was surprising. Bolivia did it in 2012, and this may be a slide. I don't remember if this.
Yeah, with coca.
With coca, yeah, they withdrew and then reacceded. And the U.S. actually was one of, I think, 17 countries to object to their reacceding to the convention, with an exception for coca plant. And they needed, I mean, you have to have 1/3 of the members object to you reacceding, which would be like 60 something members. And so it's likely not to happen. And so there has been a lot of discussions about kind of grouping countries to withdraw and reaccede with cannabis excluded. And so right now, Bolivia, they don't have to comply with the single convention as far as the coca leaf goes. That doesn't have anything to do with cocaine, except for it's obviously derived from the coca leaf. But the coca leaf itself is not a narcotic. It's they're actually, the WHO is going through a review right now on whether or not it will recommend removing it from the single convention. And as long as the WHO is a non-objective review, it should recommend it, because there are a lot of utilities for that plant and indigenous use of that plant that should be further used and permitted.
Well, it looks like I actually got ahead of with our question. This next slide does talk about treaty withdrawal and reaccession. What about these other two options? We have inter se. What's that?
Yeah, so inter se is my favorite. Here, I'm going to pull up mine just so I can. So inter se is my absolute favorite. A lot of people say it's never going to happen. I need to stop talking about it. But inter se is an interesting option. It's never been used in the drug treaty context. But basically, under international law, if two parties to a convention kind of they want to, for lack of a better word, violate the convention, but still comply with like the main objectives of that convention, then they can come into an agreement together. And for a cannabis context, let's just say the US legalized adult use today, they could enter into an agreement with Canada to trade. Because even if the US legalizes adult use today, they will still not be able to import and export adult use cannabis. And the way to do that, though, other than a couple of these other options, if the treaties change, is to enter into an agreement with, say, Canada, that they're going to trade adult use cannabis. And there's no requirement to that. They could just add it. If Mexico joined, they could add it to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it would basically be legal. They would still have to comply with the higher arching goals of the treaties. They would still have to track, report. A single agency would have to be in charge in each country, ensure that it doesn't go into illicit channels. And they'd, again, have to make sure that there's kind of safe, secure process for doing that. But arguably, especially if the US did it, and with countries like Canada and Mexico, that would be likely allowed, and it would be difficult to just tell them to stop, because as you see with Canada, they're just doing it anyway. And so that's the Caribbean nations. I know there was a question about the Caribbean, I think it was a general question about what's happening in the Caribbean. The Caribbean nations have been looking into this. They're actually looking into it for religious use, but they were for a while looking into it in adult use as well. Jamaica had been looking to move forward. Most of the countries in the Caribbean have been looking at some point either to push forward with adult use, legalization, expanded medical. They have some issues because they don't have as much leverage as some of the larger like US, Canada, Germany countries. And they really rely on exports. And there have been some external pressures placed on countries, especially in the Caribbean, where larger countries have said they would stop importing some Caribbean products if, say, Jamaica legalized. Also, Jamaica uses US banks a lot. And so the banking issue also becomes a concern for them. But the interstate option is a possible way for especially the Caribbean countries to trade amongst themselves under, say, an interstate agreement. And so that's that. Withdrawal reaccession we've talked about. Ignoring treaties is certainly an option. I think it's a risky one, especially in the climate that we have. I think there at least needs to be an acknowledgement that you're going to move forward and try to work your way into some sort of compliance. I know like people like Martin Gelsman, John Walsh, and I like this kind of phrase also. It's principal noncompliance. Where you are in non-compliance, but you're working your way towards compliance. But there's risks. I mean, Russia, adamant prohibitionist when it comes to really any drugs. They could say that they think these treaties are incredibly important. So they could say, okay, we're going to do the same as some of these countries with our arms treaties or nuclear treaties. Or, I mean, those are extreme examples, but I do think it risks kind of minimizing the importance of some of these treaties. Unlikely options.
I would play a devil's advocate a little bit on that. I think countries ignore treaties all the time, for a lot of things. And there are so many treaties out there. The United States alone, I think, signs 200 treaties a year and abides by others, but doesn't sign them because it doesn't exactly want to be bound. But I think you see this a lot with everything from, big newsy items like the use of force with Russia going into Ukraine to all sorts of other minor treaties on trade and things we don't even understand or know about. So I do think it happens a lot, countries ignoring treaties. And I do think Canada and Uruguay, as far as I've seen, haven't been punished on the United Nations or the single convention thing. So I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there as a personal sort of opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that's a definitely a valid argument. I think the drug treaties are they're a pretty prominent treaty that has a lot of kind of publicity. But I think that makes sense. And it's hard. I mean, Canada's basically doing that. And so I think that makes sense. The other ones, I'm not really going to go over the way that the mechanics work in the single convention, the voting, they're just not likely. I mean, first off, countries just aren't going to withdraw. Removing from scheduling and amending, it's just super difficult. So, yeah. And I mean, we definitely are about halfway through and we need to get to some of the countries. So I think that's what a lot of people are wanting to hear. And so I think we can probably just go to that, which is, I guess, where the next slide is.
So where do you want to start? You want to go?
It starts with recent developments.
Okay, let's go there. So we've got them on the map.
So there has been a lot of news lately about cannabis. Not all of it great, but there has been some really promising news coming out of areas around the world in different ways. Belize was a really interesting one that came out a couple weeks ago. Belize tried to legalize in 2022, I believe, through a referendum. The Catholic Church, one of the churches, came out and basically squashed that. And so that didn't really move forward. But Cape Calker, an island, their citizens just passed, they voted to allow a referendum to legalize. And so it's now going through the process in Belize. There are some questions on whether or not they'll be able to pay for it. It is pretty expensive. And whether political pressures could kind of stop that. But I think anywhere in Central South America is an important move forward. Because as we've seen, another question, what's going on with Mexico that we got? I'll talk about that in a minute I think in the next slide. But there are some really promising things going on in South America, starting with Brazil. Brazil has been moving forward at kind of a lightning speed over the last, I'd say, 6 months to a year. It was very slow moving. Under Bolsonaro, really nothing happened. The new president came in. There have been tons of court decisions, thousands of court decisions that have basically allowed individuals and medical organizations that represent patients to grow and cultivate medical marijuana as well as import marijuana. Because right now there is no regulatory framework around the actual kind of large cultivation. It's only really done within like these medical collectives, individuals, and through the research prong. Local governments around Brazil for years have been expanding research into medical efficacy of cannabis. But recently, I mean, just all of these kind of court decisions that kind of created a tipping point, and now the government, we're expected to see regulations, hopefully in September, on around cultivation of medical marijuana. There is a question on whether or not it will allow high THC flower, and the type of kind of program we see, let's just say in Germany, where you have a robust amount of products, plenty of access. That is kind of a question on what the actual program is going to look like, because that's not really expected to be part of the rules that come out soon. But just allowing cultivation in Brazil would be huge, because up until these collectives and individual patients were allowed to cultivate, it was really just all import. Each individual patient had to import individually into the country. They'd have to get their own authorization, their own import. So Brazil obviously would be a massive market to open up in medical. It could be one of the largest medical markets in the world. But we'll have to see what those regulations look like. But things are really looking promising there. Czech Republic, probably one of my favorite countries to really start moving forward. I thought they were going to be one of the ones that were able to do a full commercial program, because one of the reasons Germany was going to have difficulty is they aren't able to supply their own demand. Germany this year, under their medical program, is expected to, I think, import 140 tons of cannabis this year. I believe that's right. I have a note here in a minute. I'll double check. But they just do not have the ability to meet the demand on an adult use commercial side. And again, under the single convention, you can't import unless you enter into one of these agreements, inter-se agreement, something like that. Czech Republic, smaller country, they would have the ability to actually meet their own demand. And so I was hoping that that was going to be the case, but they also kind of inched forward and did the same as Germany, in the sense of you can have home cultivation, possession, and use are no longer crimes. And then one of the things that I think they're doing that's really interesting is they introduced this new kind of track called the Psychomodulatory Substances Act. And that basically, it was going to allow for low THC, but it sounds like right now it's just going to start with kratom extracts that can be manufactured, sold under certain regulatory requirements so that it's safe. And the next one's low THC and HHC products. They're going to be researched, and that'll be decided if it'll be added in there. But the reason they added this track is because they understand people are going to use these substances anyway. So why not provide them with a safe alternative, regulated option to access them, rather than having them go to the black market not knowing what they can do with it.
I think to maybe note quick that you didn't mention is Czech Republic is part of the EU, if anybody's wondering that. So they're dealing with sort of the same constraints as Germany, unlike Switzerland later down on the slide, who's really not dealing with EU constraints per se. Would that be fair to say?
It seems very low right now. Having trouble hearing you.
Oh, that's okay. I was just saying can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was just saying Czech Republic's not is operating within those EU constraints, and we should mention that, unlike some of the other countries, Switzerland further down on the slide, it's sort of a different rubric to operate within.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, let's just talk about Switzerland right now, since you brought it up. So yeah, Switzerland, along with a few others, Germany was hoping to be one of them. But Switzerland has been running a pilot program, which questionably operates outside of what the single convention allows. They're saying it's under kind of the scientific prong, because they're studying whether or not the health and welfare of society is benefited by a regulated program. Really, anyone who operates in this industry understands that that's true. Anyone who looks at the actual data on what happens when a country legalizes and regulates appropriately shows that it decimates the black market. It's never going to eliminate it. So any of the prohibitionists that are out there saying we shouldn't legalize because the black market still exists, that's not going to be the goal. It's impossible to eliminate that, especially when the whole world hasn't legalized. As long as you have any prohibitionist markets, you're going to have a black market. But even all these international studies show that Canada has really decimated their market. I mean, hasn't killed it, but decimated it. Switzerland, all the studies coming out of there show it cuts down on black market. It's helping with the health and welfare of society. It's benefiting society. And because of that, they're actually looking to move forward with a kind of a full legalization program. This happened much quicker than anyone was really expecting. And that's going through consultations right now. And we'll see how that turns out. The consultations, I think, end in, or maybe they're starting now and they go for another 3 months. But after that, then it'll be sent again to the government to review and kind of update the law, decide what it's going to look like. And so we're looking in Switzerland. Nothing's really going to happen in the next year, and it may even be put to a referendum for the citizens, so that could take even longer. But Switzerland could be moving forward with a full legalization program, and the reason they can do it is because they're not part of the EU, and so they don't have to worry about what those EU sanctions. And so Switzerland is really just an interesting case study of what's going on, and they're providing a lot of great scientific data on how successful these pilot programs are and actually benefiting citizens.
My understanding too, can you hear me now? Am I still
Yeah.
muffled? Okay, is that some countries like Switzerland have different threshold definitions for marijuana or cannabis than we use, say in the United States, we have a low threshold. I talked about that at 0.3 THC. Isn't Switzerland at like 1% and in some countries?
Yeah, Switzerland's at 1% for hemp. Czech Republic's also at 1% for hemp. It's interesting because the EU, I think it's at 0.3 right now. It just moved up from 0.2. There's a proposal right now to move it to 0.5. But there are countries within the EU that are different. So they range from 0.2 to 1% in the EU. And then Switzerland is 1%. There is a push to try to get kind of everyone on this 1%. To kind of help with international trade, because that again kind of fits into the industrial bucket, and so there is ability to do industrial trade in that sense. France, I'm going to kind of move pretty quickly. France, a few months ago, wasn't going anywhere with a medical program. Now it looks like they may have an incredibly robust program. It is going to be pretty restrictive. It's going to be put into the pharmaceutical regulations. There's not going to be flower, but their attempt is to try to normalize the medical aspect of it and then potentially move forward with a more expanded program that involves flower. Slovenia, they just passed an incredibly robust medical program that basically allows, if you qualify for a license, anyone can get a license. It's pretty much open on what type of ailments qualify. The doctor can basically decide. It's a whole bunch of, it's going to be very regulated, but really any type of product is going to be incredibly open. Sri Lanka, there's been some news over the last few weeks about Sri Lanka issuing licenses. Unfortunately, a lot of it's been negative within the country, that 7 licenses were issued to foreign operators investing in the country, but that's kind of the goal of it, is to bring investment into the country. So we'll see how that goes. There aren't really regulations public yet there, so it's kind of hard to tell what that's going to be. Turkey, another country that's beyond the United States and what they do. They actually have a medical framework. I mean, their actual medical framework is for like Sativex, which the US does allow, but they are starting to move forward with a low THC, which for them is 0.3%, into their medical program. So actually, as I say that, they're kind of with the US, but they at least acknowledge medical efficacy of it, and not just the pharmaceuticals now with the low THC. Ukraine, obviously you have the war going on there. It was surprising and impressive that they passed this. They allow 16 products now are on the market. Obviously PTSD and other things will qualify you for that, but they're starting to have a really kind of robust medical program there. And then the US, obviously we're waiting for rescheduling. States moving forward right now, we're kind of in a pause on that. Not too many have happened. We do have some that could potentially be coming in the next election. Rescheduling, though, I do think it's going to happen. Who knows when it's going to happen, but I do think it will happen. But again, it's not going to open up anything for anyone other than DEA registrants. There is an incredible opportunity for DEA registrants if we go to Schedule 3, and I'll talk about that at the end. But Schedule 3, 280E would be pretty much it, which is a big thing for state operators. But everything else will basically be status quo.
That's tax relief. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Tax relief, yeah. So recent setbacks. I think everyone knows about Germany. It doesn't totally understand it. So the Christian conservatives won the last election, but they had to create a governing coalition. And thankfully, they didn't do it with the extreme right AfD party. And because of that, they built a coalition with the SPD, which was a key player in leading the charge for Germany's legalization. And so basically, the CSU wants to prohibit and they would love to repeal the current cannabis law, but the SPD is not going to do that. And so the current government's looking for ways to kind of scale it back. Germany came in with a two-phase plan. The first plan, pillar is what they call it. The first pillar was implemented. That's the social cultivation collectives, home grows, personal possession. The second phase was going to be like a Switzerland pilot project. That's most likely not going to happen. The pilot project, at least under this government, is almost certainly not going to happen. They're also now trying to pull back regulations on telehealth. The industry in Germany, like I said, has just exploded. And yeah, it was 140 tons expected to be imported this year. And that's a quarter of the total demand in Germany. But the government is seeing telehealth. I mean, I was there at ICBC in May, and I watched someone become a patient and receive their medicine in 30 minutes. It was delivered to them. And that's not the intent of what the rules and law says. And so there are some operators that are they're really pushing that envelope on what's legal there, which is it's being viewed as problematic and it needs to repeal the whole thing. So the government's looking to mandate in-person doctor consultations, ban mail order medical dispensing, and just add stricter rules on prescriptions. The SPD has said that they're absolutely not going to vote for that. But with political pressure, you never know what could happen. So I do think there may be some scaling back there. I'm not sure they're going to actually repeal the whole thing. And then the whole legalization, at least as of now, is not going to be repealed. As long as the SPD is part of the coalition, that's just not going to happen. So what we have now is likely what's going to remain with some minor kind of scale backs in certain areas. Italy, Prime Minister Meloni basically issued a criminal decree criminalizing CBD flower and hemp flower, which kind of goes against an EU court decision. So that's going through the courts right now. Austria kind of went through the same thing. They're not on this list, but they kind of went through the same thing under a tobacco law framework. Austria seems to be trying to get those back on the shelves. Italy is still holding strong, although courts are saying that this violates EU law. EU law is looking like it's possibly going to change with that 0.5% and some clarity around hemp flower, actually kind of removing it and putting it into the agricultural kind of pillar so that it's clear that it's not a narcotic. So Italy, who knows what's going to happen, but that's really messing up the industry there. Portugal, they were gangbusters. They were just issuing licenses. Manufacturers were just everywhere. I mean, I was getting calls at least every couple of weeks on someone interested in Portugal. They recently had some very high profile raids where they found some licensees, just some very specific licensees were working with criminal organizations. But unfortunately, those high profile raids have really kind of put a bad taste in people's mouths about it right now. It's kind of causing people to kind of question Portugal, and because of that, and also, well, because of the raids, the rules are getting more strict. The requirements on operators are becoming very heavy and burdensome, and so that industry is kind of scaling back a bit. Still has amazing opportunity, but has definitely been scaling back a bit. Moving on to some limbo countries. I think that's our next slide.
Skip Thailand.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Thailand. Thailand's probably the biggest one and the most wild one. So Thailand was basically the Wild West. They're, I think, a perfect example of why you don't want to have decriminalization without regulation. In the short run, it may be good, but in the long run, it's really going to provide proponents or opponents of legalization with a lot of ammunition, because you get a lot of black market, because basically everything is black market pretty much because there are no regulations. It also allows for seepage, youth access, and just creates a whole lot of problems. The current government, Putai, which may not be the current government for long, they came into power, and one of their platforms was to prohibit the legalization and pull it back to just medical. They won, but they had to again create a party with a Boot Matai party. I'm not even going to try it again. It's a very difficult name. I apologize. I will learn that. I'm going to Thailand in November to speak at a conference. I will learn how to say that appropriately. But they were the ones who pushed the legalization and removing cannabis from the narcotics list. Recently, there was I'm not going to go into it, but there was a political issue with Cambodia and the prime minister who's of Putai. She said some things. The Boot Majai party, they withdrew, which basically left only prohibitionists in the governing coalition. And so they're starting to really scale back. They're pushing forward with strict medical. We don't really know what that is. And honestly, it could be a good thing. Medical framework in Thailand would be incredible because, again, right now there's really no clarity. If they can get some clarity on regulations for their therapeutic and medical program, it could really help with exports into especially Europe. The requirements of GACP and GMP would really benefit Thai medical operators who can comply with those regulations. Also, it's unclear whether or not tourists will be able to just land and basically go and get a prescription, because now they're saying prescriptions are required, but there's no prohibition on that yet. So you could just land, go to get a prescription, and then still go get your cannabis. But it is expected to close down about 18,000 current operators in Thailand. And we'll find out tomorrow if the prime minister, who's was kind of suspended by their court, whether she gets found guilty and they need to get a prime minister, which could lead to a new government, a snap election. So countries in limbo, they are, so Mexico, like South Africa, I'll kind of put those two together. Their court basically said you can't criminalize possession and home cultivation. South Africa, I think, went even a little farther. And so basically the governments came out and said, we're going to regulate. It's been years since those decisions came out. South Africa is definitely moving farther than Mexico. Really nothing has happened in Mexico. President Sheinbaum has expressed her openness to assist with hemp, but she hasn't really done anything there either. Right now, I mean, hemp's legal there at 1%. There's certain requirements, but unfortunately, if you want to enter that market, you have to sue to do it, because they won't issue licenses without suing. So you have to go through the whole court system before you can get a license. Zebra right now is the only one that's really cultivating there. But Mexico is an incredibly difficult country at the moment. Hopefully, President Sheinbaum will help with that. Morocco, it was very exciting that they came out with regulations. I know some of the people who are helping with that. But unfortunately, there's a lot of issues there with trust behind the regulations, behind the supply, the quality, and whether or not you can really, what you're getting, contracts, who's actually cultivating it. And so there's just really a lot of issues going on in Morocco. They're actually advising Ghana right now, who's looking to move forward with a program. And hopefully Ghana can get things a little clearer, and if they move forward, kind of make things more palatable for in other countries wanting to buy and source from Morocco. Netherlands, it would be great if Morocco hash could get into the Netherlands. Their pilot program right now doesn't have hash, which is a huge problem for their system. Hash is in major demand in the Netherlands. Under their pilot program, it's a domestic production for those coffee shops that are signed on and are part of the pilot program. But they can't produce enough hash, and it's not of the quality that they're used to. And so the black market is still pretty robust there. There were huge delays in the Netherlands as well because of that. And Netherlands are about to have a snap election. Their far right government withdrew, dissolved parliament, and so they'll have snap elections in October. The good news is supposed to go a little more center conservative, not supposed to go left or anything, but likely isn't going to be a government that's really like strongly opposed, but also not strongly for changes. So that's good. And then South Africa, we're hoping to get regulations here soon. We've been told that March 2026 is when regulations for the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act is supposed to come out, which would clarify the act that was passed a year ago. But South Africa has been incredibly slow moving. A few months ago, their health department basically prohibited all food with cannabis or hemp in it. And then like a week later, the president was like, no, we're not going to do that, and rescinded that order. And so South Africa has a huge opportunity. Hopefully we'll get some clarity in March. And that would definitely put South Africa kind of up there with, Canada and Uruguay and the type of programs that they have.
So we've got about 9 minutes, Jason. I'm wondering if you can somehow do this slide in 2 to 3 minutes to highlight some of these countries, because I want to get to our last two slides and really talk about what all this means for operators and investors, people who are actually doing business.
Yeah, and I think, I've already talked about a lot of these countries. So I think the big ones, so the EU CND is right now, unfortunately, the US objected to this, but this year there was a vote to kind of reevaluate the drug conventions and kind of how they work. And so the UNCND is going to be doing that. They're going to be implementing kind of a group to analyze the conventions and propose kind of ways to make them better. So that's a huge thing and could help with the framework. Whether or not I think it passes is a huge question mark. EU, they're also going through kind of a similar review for allowing ways to allow individual member states to implement their cannabis programs under the EU framework. I think those are the biggest things that are going on right now. Colombia today just came out, the president came out and said that, they proposed another legalization bill. It takes like 2 years to happen. The president says he's for it. He's getting on the legislature about it. But honestly, when he came in, there was only one more reading in the 2-year process that was needed to pass. The Senate rejected it at that point, and the bill failed. A lot of people kind of said that the president just didn't put his weight behind it after the election. He wanted his own bill to come up. And with Colombia entering into new elections and President Petro being hugely unpopular, it's really just, unless the next president wants legalization, it's really, we're 2 years away in Colombia. India is a big one. Hemp, there's certain provinces that keep expanding hemp operations. India is known for hemp for decades. Obviously for fiber, cloth, things like that, but they're actually kind of provinces are advancing their hemp operations. Lebanon's another big one. A smaller country, but also kind of a big thing that Lebanon is looking to move forward. So yeah, I think that kind of covers this.
Okay, so here's market opportunity slide. Jason, I know you wrote one piece on investing in foreign cannabis operators from a US perspective, but there's sometimes a misconception that you're somehow violating, US CSA if you go make an investment overseas. Is that the case? Not the case.
No, at least so there's no actual statutory protection, but there is a lot of judicial protection and interpretation, both at the Supreme Court level and at the circuit court level. The 11th Circuit has kind of the known case. It's US v. Lopez Venegas. And it basically says that the U.S. obligation or the Controlled Substances Act only applies domestically unless it specifically says that it applies to activities that are extra territorial, that are outside of the U.S. And so the manufacturing, distribution, sale outside of the U.S., as long as there's no intent to import it, does not violate the CSA. And so, and this has been followed in the 1st, 5th, DC Circuit, several district courts. The Supreme Court has also said that statutes are meant to be domestic unless they expressly say that they're not in this context, but just in other contexts. And so investing in foreign operators, at least under judicial law, and especially in these districts or circuits, you would not run into any issues. Banking shouldn't be an issue. It might be. And that's always something that we're happy to write legal opinions on this. I have done that, stating the legality of investing in, say, a German operator that's operating within the German program. Interestingly, the opinion applied to illegal operations. It was cocaine smuggling outside of the US. But we obviously advise, you're going to want to be investing in a legal operation. And that's what we would advise you to do. And that's the type of opinion we would write, especially for a bank or whatever you needed some assistance with on that. But yeah, under current US judicial law, it is legal to invest in foreign cannabis operators.
Okay, and then what about this next bullet point, investing in the DEA registration? First of all, there are not too many of those now, right? How many are there? 8?
There's 6 DEA registrants
6?
currently. So this is obviously, yeah, this one's a very specific one. But I do think, especially if we move to Schedule 3, there is, right now, we're in a situation where there can potentially provide some influence to DEA and the administration on changing the definition of medicinal cannabis. DEA created that out of thin air, and it's basically an FDA-approved drug. So if FDA included marijuana flower as medicinal cannabis or extract, then the DEA registrants and the USA as a whole would then become an export-only medical cannabis country. And so those DEA registrants would be able to export marijuana flower and extract to foreign countries, say Germany, with their 140 tons of imports. And these DEA registrants, who some of them aren't even cultivating right now, could then actually start making money and exporting into the global system. And the US would finally join the medical system.
Okay, and then so that's a more niche model, but how about for ancillary businesses? It seems like there are a lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, definitely. Tech, packaging, equipment. I mean, really anything that's ancillary that you have in US states can be done on the global side. Packaging, labeling, compliance. I mean, there are tons legal. I mean, just tons of ability to start companies that work with your German operators. Because again, if the intent is not to import into the US, you're not concerned with the CSA 280E, the tax burden that current state operators have doesn't apply. And so, and that doesn't apply to some ancillaries, depending on the analysis. But just another thing to think about.
Let's skip the next bullet point on hemp just because we have a slide on it at the end here. What about IP licensing?
IP licensing is another one. If you have a brand that's well known, you can license that to foreign operators. And Mike Tyson's a big one that's doing it right now. His brand, I was in the Netherlands last year. They are everywhere. Method Man's doing it, Snoop Dogg. And so, yeah, that's just another way to do it.
Okay, and then our last bullet point and slide is this exporting and importing hemp. This is something our firm's helped with for many people for many years, and there's some nuance to it. It's not like any other product. I mean, you've got certain declarations you have to make, and you've got to have a phytosanitary certificate. You've got to go through customs, and you've got to be really clear that it's not marijuana. This has been going on for quite a long time. What would you add to that, Jason? I mean, we've got all these agencies listed out with export control requirements. From the US, you don't need a specific export license. There's a lot we could say, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I know USDA on the import side, especially if you're importing an actual, let's say, tissue culture, a clone that tests at below 0.3 or seeds could step in. It's especially right now, probably pretty rare, but the USDA can have an FDA if it's a product can also step in. But a lot of it's going to have to do with the Border Patrol officer themselves. They're the ones that are kind of, if they flag it, then that could bring in those other agencies. But if they don't, then there's generally, as long as you comply with what the law says, you should be able to get it in and out of the country.
Yeah, and the standard there, at least for exporting, is that you've undertaken reasonable care. That's what it's called. And sometimes we've helped clients meet that standard by doing things like providing a lawyer opinion letter if they're trying, like one time somebody was trying to export seeds, right? And the DEA said at a certain point, seeds are not marijuana. They fall within the definition of hemp. That's helpful. But if you have a lawyer letter saying, hey, you know, we've read all of this, we've read the Controlled Substance Act, we've looked at the DEA opinion, we've done this, we've done that, that can be part of your packaging with your export product and goal. And that's about it, guys. We made it all the way to the hour. Nice job on pacing, Jason. It's 12:59. Like I said, if you missed something because we did go fast at times and you want to hear it again, we'll replay this probably within a week or so on our YouTube channel and on the Cannabic blog. Keep reading the Cannabic blog because we post updates occasionally, and you can easily find how to get a hold of Jason or me on our website. Anything else to add, Jason?
Just one question that came in earlier. Schedule 3 will not change anything on the import-export side, especially in medical. It's still currently defined as like pharmaceutical products, so it's not just going to open the floodgates for medical. And I am seeing foreign countries. I don't know about foreign countries prioritizing immigration pathways for U.S. citizens, but if you have a special ability that can only be done by you, that's likely going to be looked at favorably in these foreign countries, because these programs, especially the ones in like Germany, I think the one in France will be one. Those ones are going to be well within the regulatory framework of that country, and so their immigration policies will align most likely.
And you'll need an immigration lawyer in that country to help you. We can help you, refer you to somebody. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Gonna sign off.